Hello and welcome in. I am excited today, as always, to introduce you to our webinar today, Federal Transportation Policy, What Advocates Need to Know. My name is Marley Townsend, and I am the Communications Specialist for the League of American Bicyclists. Today, I will be joined by our very own Deputy Executive Director and Federal Policy Lead, Karen Whitaker, and I'll pass it over to her in just a moment after a few quick reminders. If you've joined the League's webinar series before, welcome back. And if this is your first time tuning in, welcome. This is meant to be a beginner-friendly session, so please don't be afraid to, chime in, add to the Q&A or to the chat with your questions at any point. And thank you all so much for joining in and taking the time to learn about this important topic today with us. And so just a few quick reminders, this session is being recorded and it will be emailed to the address that you signed up with. The recording will also be added to our YouTube channel as well as our webinar archive at bikeleague.org/webinars. Closed captioning is available through Zoom, so don't be afraid to turn that on at any time. You'll notice that all attendees have their microphones muted, but we do want you to engage and participate. So if you'd like to share where you're tuning in from and network with your fellow attendees, the chat is a great place for that. And Karen will be pausing a few times during her presentation to ask for questions. So definitely don't be afraid to add your questions. This is meant to be an accessible, beginner-friendly session, as I mentioned, so no question too small. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to Karen.
All right, thanks, Marley. I'm going to share my screen with everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here. As Marley said, this is going to be a little bit more of an intro. I'm not going to necessarily talk about the politics happening today, but more talk about the process and the players. So I'm going to start with talking about why federal policy matters, and a little bit of history, and then sort of who the big players are that make turning sort of the ideas of policy into projects. So I'm going to talk about Congress, the administration, and just a mention of state DOTs and local governments. And we'll also talk a little bit about how you can get involved. So first, when we look at overall transportation funding and where funding comes from for the projects on the ground, only about 20% is federal. 40% comes from the states, 40% comes from local governments. But I have to say the national average, results may vary. So it's different state by state. And so the reason that the league really cares about federal policy is many. One is that variability. In some states, federal funding is close to 70%. I feel like it's one of the Dakotas, it's about 70%. In California, it can be as low as 15%. So it depends on the states and their policies as well. Also, some states have restrictions, so they don't allow their own state money to be used on biking and walking, in which case federal money for biking and walking becomes more important. So I can't give you that graph on how much of biking and walking funding comes from local versus state versus federal, but we do think that, particularly in some states, that federal money is really important. The other thing I'd say from an advocacy perspective, there's an economy of scales to that, and I'll talk about that a little in a minute. The other thing is federal policy makes funds available to local governments, which we have found is very valuable for building biking and walking, and also in states where the state money doesn't go to that or less state money goes to that. And also federal policy sort of acts as a catalyst. It creates opportunities to build projects and also sets the trend for overall funding. So as I said, state funding can vary. When we look at the data from our Bicycle Friendly States report, this is sort of showing the average dollars spent on bicycling improvements per year. It's from the years 2013 to 2024. You can see, so the gray states, we don't even have data. They didn't answer that question. Blue states are spending more than red states. But again, how they calculate what they spend on biking and walking can be different state to state. So it's a little bit hard even to compare. But we will share the slides and we will share this data sheet that will show it per capita and the actual dollar numbers. Also, when I was talking about economies of scale, this is something that when we look at the larger biking and walking movement, if you look at the federal level, the league has two staffers as myself and our federal policy fellow, Safe Routes to School, RT, Rails to Trails, People for Bikes. They all have a staffer working on federal policy. So I'm saying like 4 to 8 full-time people, and we're all just working on one legislative body that affects 20%. When we look at the state level, we have 50 states, 51 if you count DC, and we probably don't have one person for each of those state bodies. When you get to local governments, the league has 350 state and local members. So if there's 300, 400 local groups, not all of them have full-time staff, and very few of them might have a full-time person just working on policy. So from an advocacy perspective, we see this in the biking movement, we see this in other places. Focusing on the federal policy is a way to affect everything with fewer people. So when we look at federal funding, one of the things that's important to remember is that since the 1950s, when we started the transportation program, and the federal government was sending money to states to build transportation, biking and walking was always allowed through those years. But for the first 38 years, we saw roughly 48 million that we know is spent on biking and walking. In 1991, Congress passed a new federal transportation bill. It was called ICE-T. And that had some dedicated funding, and that made a difference. In the first 2 years, that funding was almost equal. And that made more of a difference than the trends we were seeing on the ground or the desires of people biking. So in the 1970s, the energy crisis and the long lines for gas, we saw a huge bike boom. In the 1960s, about 90% of bikes that were sold were for kids. In the early 1970s, that had gone up to 60% being sold for adults. So we were seeing more people biking. We were seeing states pass biking laws. We saw the state DOTs, state departments of transportation, start writing bike guides and thinking about bike planning. But that is not what saw the increase in funding. What saw the increase in funding was federal legislation. So in 1991, because of all the smog, this is a picture of Louisville, right? In the smog in the 1970s. Congress passed the Clean Air Act to deal with the smog. And they realized at that point that transportation was a huge contributor to that smog. So when the next transportation bill came up, they made a major revision to how transportation funding worked and said, okay, we need to make programs within the transportation program that are going to help cities and states meet their air quality goals. And at that time, they started a number of new programs. So the one that's most important to us was called Transportation Enhancements, and that funding went for small projects. Local governments could apply to the state, and we saw there were 12 uses, but we saw a vast majority of that going to biking and walking. The bill also created programs that got money down to local government. So where most of the money was going to the state, now money was going to local government. And so that helped with biking and walking. They also created a program, as I said, to deal with the air quality. That's a congestion mitigation and air quality program. And that was for communities that were not meeting the air quality standards laid out in the Clean Air Act. And so those funds, they couldn't be used to expand roads or build capacity. They had to be used for things other than single occupancy car travel. So it couldn't be for people driving alone in their own car. So we saw more money going to transit, more money going to biking and walking, more money to HOV lanes or carpooling and things like that. It also was when Congress created the Recreational Trails Program. So that 1991 bill made a big difference in how states were spending their money. And I will say two things. One, these three programs are still the best, the programs where we get the majority of our biking and walking money. But two, I'm not going to talk about specific programs anymore, but we do have an explainer video if you want to learn more about the specific programs in the transportation bill. But the main thing I want you to get out of this is that in 1991, Congress wrote two bills, the Clean Air Act and the Ice-T Transportation Bill, and that resulted in more funding going to biking and walking. Before that, they could have spent all their transportation money on biking and walking, but it was only when these specific programs came in that they did. And so this has been the result of that. So 1990, so from 1953 to 1991, we saw 48 million spent. And then you can see the increase in a couple of years, we're getting into the hundreds of millions. As we've gone further, we're now up to over 1 billion. We're almost at 1.5 billion a year. One of the things people always ask me when I show this chart, they're like, well, what happened in 2009? This was the stimulus bill under President Obama. And that we got one line in that bill that said 3% of transportation money should go to that program, transportation enhancements. And that one line of policy ended up in over $1 billion being spent on biking and walking over the next 3 years. So that's the funding. And I tried to go back and see if we could see how state funding for biking and walking changed between 1970 then through the 1991 bill, but most states weren't recording what they were spending on biking and walking. They just started keeping that data when the federal government required it under that 1991 bill. So I went back and I looked at our bicycle-friendly communities. The League has a bicycle-friendly community program where we give awards, bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. 3 of our earliest platinum communities, Davis, California, Boulder, and Portland, were already on the bike train back in 1970s. They were already building bike lanes, building trails, thinking about safety. But once that federal money came in, their worlds changed too. There was just more funding available for them to go after. Their state DOTs were thinking about it a little more, so it was a little easier to work there. And what we saw was that was also a turning point in those communities to start investing in higher quality, separated bike lanes, trails, things like that. You'll see Davis lags a little bit, but it's a small city. And so it's basically inundated itself with bike lanes and was going back and making them safer, building biking and walking bridges, things like that. So we can see here as well that federal policy changed what was happening in cities. So some of the lessons learned on that, again, was that dedicated funding matters. Programs for specific causes, whether that's those local priorities, safety, congestion, those things really changed how both states and local governments were thinking about federal funding and what they were building with it. Local government access has made a big difference for us. And it's not, we've talked about how that funding mattered and how those programs that directed money to local governments really helped, but also things that give technical assistance. A lot of local governments may not have a transportation department or the staff that know how to design bike lanes. And so when a federal government ensures that there is technical assistance and help for communities to do those kinds of things, they do it more. The other reason we say that local government access matters is that state DOTs are often focused on the roads in between communities and not the roads within those communities themselves. So those local governments know their roads better. They know where the near misses were, and they're more likely to think about people biking and walking in that way. And then safety has always been a great argument for us, so that when opponents say we should only be spending federal money on federal issues, on federal concerns, safety is one of those. So before I go on, I just wanted to check if there are any questions or comments on that. Let's see. All right, seeing none, I'll continue on. So now I want to talk about how that federal policy comes into being. So a little bit of civics. Congress writes the law, then the U.S. administration, in this case, the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, they administer the law. And the way that transportation works is that 90% of the funding is going to states or is available for states to build projects. So the states are the ones, for the most part, implementing the law, but they need US DOT approval. So when a state builds a highway or builds a bike lane or invests in a transit bus, they take on that cost and then they apply to the US Department of Transportation for reimbursement. And so they have to follow how the US DOT administers the law and interprets that law. So that's a checks and balances. US DOT is only supposed to reimburse them if they've done what the law says. Now, Congress writes the law and the US DOT is administering it, but if Congress doesn't like the way the US DOT is administering it, they can change the law, right? So those are sort of the checks and balances in the system. So now I'm going to talk about Congress's role. So Congress develops the programs, they decide the eligible uses, they decide who's eligible to get that funding, and they set funding levels for every state for each program. So they might say, Massachusetts gets $20 for highways and $10 for transit and $5 for biking and walking, or the same for Utah, kind of thing. So the bill that we care about is the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, which is the process by which Congress sets transportation policy and funding for 5 years. The last authorization bill passed in 2021. It was called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the administration called it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That's the same bill. It passed in 2021. It gave us 5 years of funding and policy, so it's almost over. It's due at the end of September 30th. And so Congress either needs to write a new bill or they can extend it. Right now we're looking at an extension, but the bills are written with the idea that they will be in place for 5 years and then Congress replaces it. So a quick reminder on how a bill becomes a law. In order for a bill to become a law, both the House of Representatives and the Senate has to pass the exact same language and then give it to the president for them to sign. So just keep that in mind. Basically, a bill has to be introduced by a member of Congress, and so a member of the House of Representatives has to introduce a bill in the House, a member of the Senate introduces in the Senate. When we're talking about the transportation bill, it's usually the chairman or the chair of that committee plus the ranking member. So the highest ranking Democrat, highest ranking Republican. And that is the case. So we've seen a transportation bill get reintroduced this year in the House, and it was bipartisan. It then goes to the committee. So the committee members get the first crack at it. So they can say, I want to change this part, and then the committee votes on that. So they can amend it, make changes to it, and then they vote it out of committee. When it gets voted out of committee, it goes to the full House of Representatives floor, and everybody votes, and it passes there. And one of the confusion that happens a lot is that I'll send an email being like, the House passed a transportation bill, and I'll get a lot of people worried that that's the final law. It's not the final law until the Senate passes it too. So the Senate goes through the same process. Usually the House goes first, doesn't really matter. In the Senate, there's a bunch of committees, so they have to do all their different parts. They put it into one bill, they send it to the full Senate, they vote on it. And then assuming that the House bill is different from the Senate bill, which it almost always is, they then can go to a conference committee where members of the House and members of the Senate work together to work out those details. When they then have a final bill, that's when that same exact language passes through the House and the Senate and goes to the president. So this, just keep that in mind as we talk about this. But it's one of the reasons that policy can take such a long time, because you have so many people that have a hand in it. So when we talk about the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, I first want to focus on what we mean by surface transportation, by which we mean highways, transit, and then what they call the safety title. So when we talk about the highways title, that's everything that has to do with streets and roads and interstates, as well as sidewalks and bike lanes and trails. So just because if you hear a program is eligible for highways, that doesn't mean that biking and walking isn't eligible. Biking and walking are considered highway modes or users of the highway system. So that is one chapter or title of the bill. Transit is another title. And then the third is, we call the safety title, but it can include a lot of research. It can include car safety standards. It can include enforcement efforts. It can include education, but it's all the things that don't actually go on the road. So that's what we mean by surface transportation in the bill. When we get to reauthorization, I want to talk about that. So Congress basically has two things it can do with respect to federal agencies. One is it can authorize things. The other thing is it can appropriate funds. So authorize is how you is how they set the policy. So they could say something like, we're going to spend, you can spend up to 100 million on this, or Congress can spend not more than 50 billion on that. They can set, we talked about the different programs that can have specific rules to them. They can set those rules. So that congestion mitigation and air quality program, they said, okay, you can't use that to build car lanes, but you can use it to build HOV lanes or bus rapid transit or bike lanes and trails and things like that. So they can say how they can use the money. They can also direct the US Department of Transportation to set safety standards for cars. So they can say, you have to do automatic emergency braking, or we want you to research safety regarding micromobility or something like that. That's the authorizing part. It's called reauthorization because there's been an authorization bill in the past. They're updating it. So when we talk about the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, we're not talking about building something from whole cloth. They're making changes, mostly tweaks to what they did before. That 91 bill was also a reauthorization that actually did revamp the whole program, but that is pretty rare. The other thing they can do is authorize, and that's where they set the level of funding. So they could say, you get 30 billion for community block grants, but they are not supposed to appropriate anything that hasn't been authorized, right? And they're not supposed to set policy. And this is another checks and balances in our system, that two committees are supposed to touch something before both the policy and the funding go into place. So authorization is handled by one committee, appropriations in general is handled by another. So I'm going to give a couple of examples outside of transportation. So for instance, there's a farm bill that sets agriculture and conservation and nutrition assistance programs. In that bill, they authorized 75 million for a rural energy savings program, but Congress only put in 4.2 million. In the National Defense Authorization Act, the authorizing committee said, okay, they authorized up to 175 million a year for the Baltic states, and the Appropriations Committee said no. So for most federal policy, this is how it works. And so you have to a group like ours would have to work on both sides. That's not the case for transportation, but I did want to say this for folks who have worked on other issues and are a little, when the budget process comes up, they're always like, what can we do? How do we work that? We don't have to work the annual budget process as much because transportation is different. when Congress started doing transportation bills, they set up the Highway Trust Fund. And the Highway Trust Fund is basically a bank account where like all of our gas taxes go in. There's some other excise taxes, some taxes on trucks. That goes into the Highway Trust Fund, but that money can only be spent on transportation, whether that's highways or transit or biking and walking. And because this money is specific for that and it can't be taken for healthcare or defense or anything like that, that allows Congress to write a 5-year bill. So transportation is unique in that way, in that this one bill sets both policy and funding. It both authorizes and appropriates. And transportation interests say, well, it's really important because a bridge takes multiple years and we need that certainty. I think people in other issues could make that cause, but that's our argument for why we need a 5-year program. So the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Program both authorizes all the transportation programs that can get funding, and it appropriates funds for most of them. And most of the programs we care about are appropriated over that 5-year process. Something that's good about that is that we don't have to fight for funding every single year. And that's good because if we get a policy in place and we get funding for that policy, we get a few years to watch it before we have to decide, do we want to keep advocating for funding for that? Or do we want to change that policy? So it's nice to have that 5 years in that way. What could be bad about that is if we get a bad bill, if biking and walking funds were to get wiped out, we would have to wait 5 years to get it back in place. Or it would be much harder to get it back in place. The other thing is that the congressional staff that follow transportation, sometimes a lot of that job, there's a lot of turnover. So lots of times when the transportation bill starts up again, we have to go in and educate new congressional staffers every time about, this is what this bill does, and this is why advocates, people in your community care about it. All right. So I'm going to open this for questions again to see if there's any questions on transportation policy. But in the meantime, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do as a lobbyist. And that's one, I spend a lot of time getting to know those congressional staff, sometimes getting to know people at the administration. And my goal is to be an asset to them, to be helpful and responsive and trustworthy so that they know they can ask me questions, that I can help them. And then also that, when I need to ask for their help, I can ask for their help. And this is something that I ask advocates to help me with, to also build relationships with your congressional representatives and senators. I also, of course, read and analyze legislation, keep up to date on what's happening with Congress. I sometimes offer to write pieces if that's helpful to a congressional office. But knowing what's going on, being able to read the legislation, and then having those relationships with Congress is really important. But the other major thing I do is this kind of stuff. It's communicating with partners and advocates at the local, state, and federal levels. When a big transportation bill is coming up, so like starting in 2024, I started asking state and local biking advocacy groups and other folks like, people working on biking and walking, what's working, what's not, what would you like to see changed? And we sort of filter that through our different partners. We talk to our national partners who may represent environmental groups, or they may represent cities and local governments, and say, we're hearing about this. What do you think about that? We talk to congressional offices. So there's that flow of information from the state and local groups up. And then I also communicate back to folks about, hey, this is what's happening in Congress. Can you contact your member of Congress and ask them about this? Or can you thank your congressional office because they just sponsored this bill, or that kind of thing. But it's most of what I do is talking to other people and trying to help out and be a trustworthy partner. A couple of things you can do. is, I mean, the main thing really is to convey that you care about safe and accessible places to bike. And to all your elected officials, we're talking about federal policy, so we're thinking about Congress. You don't necessarily need to know the details. That's my job, but you can ask me and we can, I can help you with that. It's People are always nervous about going to their members of Congress because they feel like they don't know all the specifics. That's okay. They don't really expect you to. They might ask you questions you don't know, but I can help you with that. So how do you convey that? It can be through a bunch of ways. It can be like responding to an action alert, writing your own letter, going to public events or town halls when they're in the area, inviting them for a bike ride, meeting with them in the district, or our favorite, of course, is for you to come to the National Bike Summit in Washington, D.C., where we'll help you with that. These are some our Hawaii delegation with the gentleman on the right. He's the representative, Ed Case, hanging out with his constituents. Folks below that are constituents from Louisiana in their congressional office. So you can see they both have like their own personal cultural piece. It's a fun day. It's fun to meet with your member of Congress. They want to meet with you. So please do consider it. You can do it with friends or a couple of friends. And if you're interested, but you're not sure what the big ask is, just let us know. We'll set up a one-on-one Zoom meeting and help coach you through that. All right. Do we have any questions on Congress? Let's see, I see Q&A. All right, so I have the question of how does federal transportation funding actually reach local practitioners? Part of it is through advocating for Congress. And so that's some of the things we just talked about. I'll also talk a little bit more about how it goes now from Congress to local governments. And how do you write emails to Congress people? Do they actually read them? So two things I would suggest. One is there is someone in every congressional office that reads the emails. To be fair, if you're responding to an action alert, they're sort of tallying them up and then they're letting the member of Congress know that. If you want to do something that's more personal, one way to do that is to get to know the staff, whether it's the district staff or the national staff. The district staff, every member of Congress has at least one office in the district. They generally have several, so there's probably one close to you. And when they're on recess or they're working in their district, which they will all be doing for all of August, you can call that office and you can make an appointment, and you're much more likely to actually get the member of Congress there. So you could meet them there, or you could send a letter to or an email to that district office. The district office gets a lot less email than the federal office, so you're more likely to get the specific person. But once you've met, the reason I'm pushing you for a meeting is because once you go to the meeting, you're going to meet the staff, and then you're going to have their personal email. And then that staffer will read them and generally respond, and then you can start a relationship that way. I probably do 90% of my work with the staff. So having that relationship with the staffer is great. The staffers that work up on Capitol Hill, they're the experts on policy. The staffers that work in the district office are more experts on the district. So either will work in your case. Okay. Let me see. Let me continue on. So now I'm going to talk about the agency and the Department of Transportation and what it means to administer the bill. And they sort of do three things. They interpret, implement, and enforce the bill. That's how I'm going to talk about it. So remember, the USDOT interprets, so they take the law and try to figure out what does this mean? How should it be operationalized? And then they write directions to the state DOTs about, okay, this is how you should operationalize, this is how you should implement that law. And then they also write, then the state has to implement the law that way in order for USDOT to reimburse them the funds. And remember that 90% of federal funds flow through the state DOTs. Okay, So now I'm going to give you an example in law, because you might be thinking, if Congress wrote the law, why does it have to be interpreted? Shouldn't it just be written clearly so that everyone understands? Well, that would be great. But it can get complicated. So this is one paragraph that we've worked on, and it's about biking and walking access on bridges. So it says, in any case where a highway bridge deck being replaced or rehabilitated with federal financial participation is located on a highway on which bicyclists and pedestrians are permitted to operate at each end of such bridge, and the secretary determines that the safe accommodation of bicyclists and pedestrians can be provided at a reasonable cost as part of such replacement or rehabilitation, then such bridge shall be replaced or rehabilitated as to provide such safe accommodations. Okay. Maybe not as clear as it could be. But basically, so a couple of definitions. A bridge deck, we're talking about the top of the bridge. We're not talking about the structural reinforcements. They could replace the structural reinforcements and not have to do this. And also remember that a highway is not just an interstate. It could be a road or a street as well. So what they're trying to say here is that if you can bike and walk on either side of the bridge, and if that replacement of that bridge deck can be done at a reasonable, and adding biking and walking access to it can be done at a reasonable cost, then they should do it, right? So that's the goal. Pedestrians is in red here because before 2021, this was only for bicyclists. Pedestrians were added in. But again, we're trying to say you should add biking and walking access on your bridge if it's a reasonable cost. So this comes to USDOT, and then their job is to interpret, like, what is an accommodation? Does that mean you have to have a sidewalk, or could you just have a shoulder? When it was just for bicyclists, does that mean you have to have a bike lane? Or can you say, well, sure, the speed limit is 55 miles an hour, but bikes are technically allowed, so we don't have to add anything. And then it's sort of, what does access mean? If it's on an interstate where biking and walking is not allowed, but there's bike paths on either side, are they then, does that project get caught up in this bill? The other thing they have to determine is, what is a reasonable cost? So in the case of a bike lane, if you're just striping the lanes, are we talking about, the design and the paint and doing that and the cost of a sidewalk? Or if we're saying that the bike lane and the sidewalks now make up 20% of the bridge, so they're 20% of the cost. Like, these are all things that have to be determined. And then you have to say, what's a reasonable cost, right? Is it is it in a vacuum? Are we doing a benefit cost analysis? What would it require? Like, what if it requires losing a travel lane? Is there another benefit cost on that? And so even though the law might have seemed very clear to Congress when they wrote it, it's not necessarily clear to everyone at those 50 state DOTs who now have to interpret it or have to implement it. So the role of the US Department of Transportation is to interpret it. And every administration determines it differently. So pre-IIJA, when it didn't have cyclists, they would often say, like, oh, if the bicyclists are allowed on the road, then that's fine, you're done. But they would sometimes say, like, okay, there's trails on either side, that counts even if they're not allowed on the bridge. And that's where you might get something like the Golden Gate Bridge. Reasonable cost, like before 2021, a state, if they're doing the bridge, they could say, you know what, it's not a reasonable cost, it's going to cost too much, we're not going to do it. And in general, the USDOT wouldn't push back on that. The Obama administration did in some places, or they would incentivize adding it, but the interpretations varied. Under Secretary Buttigieg, they said, okay, trails on either side count. If you've got access trails on either side, you've got to create that access. And they needed clear reporting on what they were going to do to create that access for people biking and walking. They also defined reasonable costs as less than 20% of the cost of the whole bridge project. So that was huge, because 20% is a lot, and most bridges can do biking and walking under that. But the assumption was that the cost was going to be reasonable, and project owners had to show their math. They had to show that it was going to cost them more than 20% to create the bridge. Now, there is some flexibility in that. So there was a major bridge between Ohio and Kentucky that got built, that got refurbished without biking and walking, but they added biking and walking to a parallel bridge. Under the current administration, I'm not sure how they're defining access and accommodation, but they've basically said that it's not reasonable to require biking and walking access. There's no cost that's reasonable. And they've actually required project owners, people building the bridge, to prove why they need it. So even when the law is the same, this is why who's at the USDOT and who's making those decisions matters. So that's one thing they do. They interpret the law and then decide if states are following it when they reimburse them. The other thing is that while Congress decides how much transportation funding a state gets and for which uses, USDOT also gets about 10% of funds that get administered as grants. So if you've heard of a Safe Streets for All grant, or you've heard of a RAISE grant or Build grant, that's when local and state governments apply to USDOT for a specific project. And so an example of this is that in 2009, Congress created a program to help states and local government build multimodal, multi-jurisdictional projects. And these are projects that are hard to build under regular funding. So for instance, that bridge between Kentucky and Ohio, whose responsibility is it? Is it Ohio? Is it Kentucky's? So they got together and wrote a grant for this program that is helping them rework that bridge. By multimodal, I mean different transportation modes. So does it help people biking? Does it help people take transit? Does it help people biking and walking, or taking a ferry or something like that? So the program was started in 2009 under the Obama administration. It was called the Tiger program at the time. When the Trump administration came in, they renamed it Build. When the Biden administration came in, they renamed it RAISE. And now we're back to the Trump administration and they're calling it Build again. But basically, the thing that has changed is the name. The criteria are mostly the same. It's like, but they're big. They're like environmental sustainability, safety, economic competitiveness, community development. They're big things like that. They've added a few things like keeping funding reasonable between urban and rural areas. But you can see where implementation, who's implementing it, matters. Honestly, under the Obama administration, when this came out and biking and walking was getting 6%, we thought that was amazing. Because up until then, we were getting, during the 90% that goes through the states, we get about 2% of that. So when we were getting 6% of this grant program, we thought that was amazing, right? The Trump administration came in. I got this data from the Eno Center. They said none of it went to biking and walking. I would quibble. I think there's a couple projects that did. So that's what you're seeing in parentheses. But, it wasn't so great. But then under the Biden administration, it was phenomenal for biking and walking projects. We did really, really well based on the grants that they awarded. So that's just another case that people are policy, and that the administration not only regulates what the states do, but also has a role in implementing it. All right. So I am gonna stop again and see if we have any questions. Let me see if I can get up there. I see one question in the Q&A. Why did different administrations keep renaming transportation bills and grants? Seems confusing and hard to keep up with. Yeah, so it's basically an ego thing. They want to be connected to that grant. They want that grant and those awards to be theirs. And they want to emphasize different things. So when Biden was emphasizing safety and equity and climate, when the Trump administration came in, they said, that's, we want to emphasize building things. And so that's the change. When it comes to the bills and the reauthorization bill is a term like Kleenex, right? Or tissue is a term like, and then there's the different brands are below. Or better example, reauthorization is like the word soda. And then each time they redo it, it could be Coke or Pepsi or Sprite or whatever. It's just that who's ever the primary author that time or the primary decision maker wants to take credit for it. Okay. So how do we influence the administration? When the administration makes new standards or regulations, whether they be car safety or how they're going to award grants or things like that, when they change the federal rule, they have to make it public. They have to solicit public input. And we as the league can put in input. You as individuals can do that. We've seen this be very successful in the past. It has not been as successful right now under the current administration, at least for us. So we sometimes ask for help with those things, and we will continue to do that, just to be on the record for how we feel. Another way that the league influences the administration or any organization can is by serving on an advisory committee or a commission. The league has done that a few times. Or sometimes the USDOT or other agencies will solicit expertise. And so they'll ask us, well, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And we are always happy to share. But the way our system works, right, it's much easier to influence elected officials than appointed officials. And the administration is appointed officials. Okay. So the third side of this, Congress writes the law, USDOT interprets it, and then state DOTs implement that law. And remember, 90% of the funds come in through the state departments of transportation or DOTs. This is so they are big players, right? While the federal government determines how much funding a state gets and for what program and who's eligible for it, the state departments of transportation decides what to build where, right? And in a lot of cases, they can transfer money. So they can transfer money from out of the safety program into congestion mitigation and air quality or into the highway program. Like they have some ability there. Also, federal money generally comes with a requirement for the state or local government to put in money. And so the state also has that power when they're deciding what they're going to fund or how they're going to fund it. Yeah, and so they're a really important player in this. There's also a little bit of that 90% goes to metropolitan planning organizations. And so these are organizations, it's a policy board that can be made up of city, county, and state leaders. And they basically plan and approve federal transportation funds for major roads, shared use trails, public walking in their communities. For MPOs that are planning for a community of 200,000 or more, they actually have that, what we call obligation authority, which means that they get to select the projects and they get to sign the contracts, which is really important because that means they can move those contracts forward. So all of the circles on these maps represent a metropolitan planning organization that has that power to help spend federal money. And the planning is in the name. They also are in charge of, they also do regional plans. All right. So if you're interested in in their priorities, there's a couple of things I would suggest to you. One would to use our Connect locally and talk to a biking and walking advocacy group in your state or your community. So, and again, we'll share the slides with these links. You can look up your zip code and it will tell you whether or not there's a state or local organization in your area that is a member of the League of American Bicyclists. The other, if you wanted to get really wonky, you can find your MPO, or you can look at their plans. That's more of like a 201 or a 301, but just know there's other ways to figure out what your state is doing. But the most important thing to remember is that through all of this, every little thing you do, every time you respond to an action alert, whether it's us or your state or local group, you know, if you come to the National Bike Summit, if you go to a town meeting and you mention biking and walking, all of that works together to influence all of these levels of transportation funding and federal policy. So if you have questions, I'm gonna stop presenting now, but you know, please let me know if you have questions. You can ask them now, you can email me later. We also will share some other like explainer videos we have on how the reauthorization process works, what the different funding programs are, and things like that. So thanks again for listening, and I will open it up to questions. Let me see. So, all right. Oh, so we got a question on why did rail drop so low? So that was regarding that big grant program that under the Obama administration was super high, and then under the Biden administration was much lower. That dropped because in that 2021 big bill, there was a ton of money there for rail. And so rail, interestingly, while the highway and the transit money, we get 5-year chunks, rail gets 1-year chunks through the budget. But the 2021 bill gave them 5 years of funding. And so the Biden administration knew that they were getting that funding and was giving them less awards. Under the Obama administration, they needed that funding and they weren't always getting enough funding from Congress every year. So the Obama administration was trying to make that up through those grants. All right, we got a question on action alerts. So action alerts are if you get an email from the League of American Bicyclists, or maybe your state and local group saying, please contact your congressman now, or your senator now, and ask them to co-sponsor this bill or to do this. That is a way that you are showing them, I care about this biking and walking ask. And so you can fill that, you can fill that out on your phone or your computer, and it will zip them an email. That's more of an anonymous email, but it is a way to show numbers and show that people in their district care. One of the things that the research has shown is that if you've got a member of Congress, maybe your congresswoman, she doesn't have really a position on biking and walking as a federal issue. It's not something she's really had to work on in her career. The best way to influence her is for her to hear from her constituents. And action alerts are sort of those general emails. That helps. Visiting them in their district office makes a huge difference. The number one way that will influence them is constituents coming to Washington, D.C. So those are, but either way, those visits make a huge difference, and they make more of a difference than, say, a lobbyist going. So we got a question about the current administration's reduction in staff in both US DOT and the US Department of Justice offices overseeing civil rights investigations enforcement. Any suggestions on encouraging greater enforcement of road, sidewalk, transit stop accessibility issues under ADA? Again, I think the best way for us to influence this administration is indirectly through Congress. And so I would say reach out to your members of Congress, reach out work on things on your state, let them know what's happening in your state, and ask those folks to reach out to the administration. So we got a question about a comment period on a local plan, a transportation improvement program. And they said, I'm not a professional advocate, just a nosy citizen. Is there somewhere I can find inspirational lingo from our website as input for comments? Yeah, we can get back to you with some facts and figures, but I would also look at your state and local groups. If you're in San Francisco, the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition may have some draft comments that they're working on that you can pull from and submit. So there's a question, if federal funding is only 20% of the total, is there some logic around focusing more on what our state DOTs are doing with the money? That makes sense, right? If they're 40%, and actually they're going to control that federal money when they get it. The two thoughts I have on that, it is much harder to influence an agency versus a legislative body. And so that's one reason to go to Congress versus trying to influence all the state DOTs. A second reason is that every state is different. So that is something that the state biking and walking advocacy groups do and other state level advocacy groups do because they know their state and they'll know those levers. At the federal level, it's really hard to be an expert on 50 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, right? So it's a really important reason why federal groups should have partnerships with state groups so we can help each other out. But yeah, but it is that economies of scale because now you have to know 51 systems versus one. All right. How does the move towards a unitary executive, i.e. clawing back appropriation grants, firing non-political appointees, etc., affect how you approach your lobbying efforts, if at all? Okay, that is not a 101 question, but I'll answer it. That's why I'm focusing on Congress, because Congress is ultimately responsible to its state and local folks. So recently, the House had a 5-year transportation bill, and it went through the committee on the House side. And the Transportation Committee has, I think at the time, there were 33 Republican members and 30 Democrats. There were a couple of people missing, right? And they had to vote on whether or not to continue to fund the Transportation Alternatives Program, which is like 50% of our funding. And so the amendment was eliminating transportation alternatives. Only 7 people in that committee agreed, or 9 people in that committee agreed, and 54 voted against it, which means the vast majority of members, both the majority of Republicans and all the Democrats, said, no, we don't want to do that. So that gives me faith that we have a place to move, right? That's a place where we have some support, that we can help change minds. That's a lot easier to work for. That doesn't mean we aren't opposing moves that the administration is making. They wanted to remove a bike lane in DC. We worked with the Washington Area Bicyclists Association, or WABA, the local group, to really push back on that. WABA filed a court case and they won. And so that would be another way. Legislation can be really expensive. So we are focusing on Congress because this administration, right, it's 4 years and we're in a year and a half in. They can still do a lot of damage, but there will be a new Congress. And the bill that we're working on will live longer, will be in effect longer than this administration is in office. All right, we got a question on working with your MPO. First I would see, if there's a state or local group in your state or in your region that's already working with them, and ask that. And the next thing is to go out and reach out. I know in Orlando, the Orlando Bike Advocacy Group, they actually work with their MPO all the time, which means that they then can have some influence um, on the planning and what programs they choose. Because when MPOs, sometimes they run the grants and they help make those choices. In Yeah, like in Arizona, one of our health partners is actually part of the committee that gets to decide how the transportation grants are spent. And so like you can work that way. You can just go to public meetings. Your MPO is probably like, I don't know, 3 to 10 people. They're not huge organizations. So you can call them up, ask them what they're working on, ask them, how can I get involved? And there is a link on the slide to find your MPO to help you do that. No, great question. Rudy, don't worry about it. Okay, so this is last question, because Marley's back. On that bridge language, that does not apply to railroad bridges. But yes, we would love to chat about how to work on getting bike access on railroad bridges as well.
Well, that was awesome. We are at time now, just a minute past. So thank you for all your questions, and thank you, Karen, for sharing your expertise with us. As I mentioned in the chat, because it's relevant to people interested in influencing federal transportation policy, our next summit is we've announced the date. It'll be next March 9th through 11th. So we'd love to see you there. Have you join us in lobbying on Capitol Hill. And we have opened our request for proposals. So if you have a big idea and you want to share it, please, submit your proposal in the link that I shared. And yeah, that's all I've got for you today. And as mentioned, we'll be sending out the recording and the slides and all the links that we mentioned over email. So thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.